Morning everyone, welcome to Longton Motorsports. This morning we're going to work on this 2003 F7. The deal here was we had some tracks for sale left over from when we were racing Firecats cross country. We had to go up to 1.25" tracks to meet the semi-pro rules. So we had a bunch of tracks left over because we had bought up a number of tracks and set up ice tracks, trail tracks, etc. But I had a nice track left over for sale, fully clipped, decent condition. Had it for sale on Facebook Marketplace. Ran into a guy that wanted to put it in his F7. I let him know what we learned. What we learned was that the 2003s, because we were doing, we had an early build F6 and an 03 F5 that we were racing. In order to get an 1.25" track in those, you have to cut it. You have to go down to the 9-tooth driver. So the job today is help this guy out. We're gonna tear into it. We're gonna get the old track out. We're gonna check and see maybe it does for some reason have a 9-tooth driver instead of the stock 10-tooth driver on these 2003s. Replace the 10-tooth drivers with some 9-tooth drivers that I got. Put the new track in it, or the 1.25" track in it, and just kind of check over a number of things. As many of you know, we got a long history racing these Firecats, so if it's broken, I know where it's going to be broken, or at least where it's going to break. So we're going to do a little shakedown for the customer and make sure it's good to go. They're hoping to do a bunch of riding out in the Black Hills with it, so should be a fun little project. I plan to do a how-to on swapping tracks. Maybe I have already, I'm not sure. I'll have to dig through my old videos. Anyway, should be a nice easy little project. I'm sure we'll run into no issues whatsoever. That's a joke if you couldn't tell. Shout out to Austin Leak, ALR, Austin Leak Racing, number 22. Just happened to put his shirt on this morning. All right, step one, swapping track on a Firecat. It's going to be remove the belt. Step two, remove the secondary. Step three is going to be remove the voltage regulator, which acts as a bearing race for the drive shaft. The nuts on the voltage regulator are 1/2" socket, so just a small ratchet so you can reach in there and get them backed out is all you need. So that's what it looks like once you got the voltage regulator off. You can see the bearing for the drive shaft right here. This here acts as a shoulder for said bearing. Step 4, we're going to remove the chain case cover. You're going to use the same small ratchet and 1/2 inch socket, as these will all be 1/2 inch heads on the bolts that cover that. So we'll pop that cover off so that we can access the inside chain case. You want to grab a pail and your 7/16 and drop the oil out of the chain case by pulling this plug. So you just drop a pail up underneath there, 7/16. I use a ratcheting box end wrench, pull that plug out. Step 5 is going to be removing the chain and the gearing. You may have to release the chain tension on the chain tensioner, so that would be 9/16 wrench. We'll loosen that up, and then 3/4 inch socket will take the castle nuts off of the gears so you can pull the gear and the chain. Damn it. So the last bit of step 5 here is going to be, we got to remove this bracket that's holding the bearing to the chain case and the shaft, and that again, you'll use your 1/2-inch socket on. So there's three nuts there holding that on. Based on the nuts that are on this one, I can tell someone's had it off before. So this isn't the first time this one's been apart. All right, step 6 is going to be to remove the skid. That's going to be a process of removing the 2 bolts that hold the rear axle, that holds the axle for the torsion springs, and then 2 bolts that hold the front arm in the tunnel as well. So you'll need a pair of 9/16 wrenches, and that'll get both the front and the rear done. Then you'll flop it on its side and pull the skid out. So now that we have the skid out, we actually have the axle unhooked completely, we should be able to lift up on that and pull the axle out and pull the track out, and then we will work on switching that axle over to a 9-tooth, unless it already is, but by the looks of it, it's a 10-tooth. All right, step 8, our little project here. We're gonna use a press. We're gonna push these 10-tooth drivers off the shaft, and then I got some 9-tooth drivers. 2, 4, 6, 8, 9-tooth drivers. We're gonna press back onto the shaft. Now, a couple of things here. The shaft will be nice and clean where the current drivers are sitting, so I'll be able to use that to line it up. I also have the center measurements. I got a manual, a 2003 performance manual that shows me those distances, so I'll be able to measure exactly where they need to be. The drivers I got are a little bit different widths, possibly. They look actually the same. So yeah, we'll get that centered. I'll make sure to use the timing marks on the drivers so that those end up keyed correctly when I push them on. Once that shaft's ready to go, then next step would be to basically do steps 1 through 7, 6, I don't even remember where I'm at. To do those in reverse. So we'll put the track back in, I'll get the shaft in place. We'll do it a little out of order from how we took it apart. So we'll get the shaft in place, I'll get the bearings set and all that ready. We'll get the chain case shut back up, the voltage regulator back on, and then we'll put the skid back in last. Otherwise you're pulling the wrong direction and fighting yourself. So anyway, back to this. We're gonna throw my makeshift press up on the bench here, press these drivers off, and press these on. I'll try to get video as best I can. It's kind of a long process and a little bit of trial and error, so bear with me. we got our shaft done. So now that that's ready to go, we're gonna maneuver this and the track into place. Once I get bearing put back on this side, we're gonna put a new set of bearings in. So we'll get this maneuvered into place. We'll get the sled flap back over. Tighten the bearings up into place with the track in. Throw the skid in. Pretty much done. Precursor, I'm going to be setting the track in here. I'll stuff kind of the top end into the tunnel, but I'll leave enough opening I can get the shaft in here. The longer end of the shaft will go into the chain box, so I'll slide it up and then down, and I'll make sure my bracket's pushed in place. At which point I'll probably flip this back down because it is leaking gas on the floor. So rather than having a stinky shop, get that roughly in place, flip it back down, and get back to work. These tracks are directional, so I'm going to want the arrow. You'll find an arrow on the track pointing which direction it should go. The top of the track, I want to go on the north direction there. So I got the track in there, the shaft just loosely let in there holding the track in place. I'm going to start on the clutch side, and I'll put the voltage regulator back in place to tighten up the left-hand side of the sled before we go back over, do the bearing, the O-ring, the retention plate, and the gearing. So when you're old, and the chain case cover. So press, like 6-ton press that's been taken apart and cobbled together and cut and ground on, finally bites you back. The trick here is to reach up underneath and hold that, and turns your hand into kind of a balloon that we put on the shaft behind the You just make the trip and go get the proper upright shop press that you've needed for the last few years and you've just been putting off. So I guess my intermediate step is going to be to put together my new press. I find that the holes on the voltage regulator are often a little undersized. On our Firecats we were racing, we went ahead and drilled them out because we were swapping tracks a lot. I did not do that in this particular case, so it's going to take a little patience to get that regulator started. We've about got it, but a nice little reminder for everyone: before you put the bearing on, make sure you put your bracket back on, otherwise you're going to end up taking the bearing back off and putting it back on again. And I had to hammer the original one off and I pressed the new one on. You don't want to do that any more times than you have to. So remember to put your bracket back on. So I got the bearing onto the shaft and started into place. The chain case itself acts as the back race. The front one would be the bracket that we took off during disassembly. The inside of that bottom bearing has an O-ring in it, so it does take a little bit of effort to get it pushed onto the spline. So if you're trying to push that bearing on and it won't go, flip it off, take it off, look in the center diameter and make sure there's an O-ring in there so you know you got the right bearing. And then don't worry about pushing kind of hard. It'll pop, you'll be able to push it by hand. But it does take some effort to get it to the state you see here where I got it pressed up and just started into the chain case itself. And I'll stop here. We'll get that bracket in place. If I gotta finagle it, push it further onto the shaft a little bit, I will, but don't panic if that seems like it's not going on. You just gotta push it. It just doesn't like to start straight. You get hung up. Once you got a couple of them started, you can tighten them up a little bit. It'll bring it into square. That's all that looks like as I got it pressed down. Just goes right around the outside. So there you go. Voltage regulator's back in place. Now we're gonna move over to the chain case side. You can see the bearing laying down here that we're gonna replace. We'll clean all the dirt and crap out of the chain case. Get this put back together and closed up. We'll remember to put the drain plug in. We'll also remember to fill it up with oil. And yeah, then job's done. Well, I guess we gotta put in the skid. That always is fun. All right, I like to set the chain tension before I put the cover back on. What I did when I loosened up the chain tensioner was when I turned on the jam nut, I didn't move it very far because I like to use that as a gauge for how tight it was. But you just watched me back it off a little bit, and here's why. How I set chain tension is I thread it in by hand. Just finger tight. You watch the chain tighten up. My jam nut's in my way here. Gotta back it off a little bit. So I'll go in. Right there's finger tight. If you check on the chain, that's pretty good. So honestly, I go finger tight and then I set the jam nut. The jam nut might turn it a little bit tighter, but it's not going to do like a quarter turn or anything like that. So that's how I set my chain tension. Y'all can tell me I'm wrong. The bearing set should come with a couple of O-rings as you see here as well. And I'll put the part number for the O-ring sets that, or the bearing sets that I use. The bearings I use come with the O-rings. They come in a pair, left and right side for the shaft. This O-ring we're gonna push around the outer diameter of the bearing. It just gets sandwiched between the chain case and the bracket to seal the oil into the chain case. So I jumped ahead a little bit. I got the bracket, the 3 nuts put on, got it tightened up. Obviously gear and chain are on. I put those on as a unit, so I'll wrap the chain around both the gears, lower them down in there with both hands, and they should just slide right into place. Then for the washers that go on the gearings, they're actually concave washers. So the dish side is going to go towards the gear. It'll make sense when you're holding them. So those will go on like dish side in. We'll put the castle nuts on, tighten them up, and then we'll put the cover on. So something worth talking about for the next step, putting the skid back in. I will get the skid put into the track. I will slide it in place, and I will put in place the